At 65, Dominique Wilkins should exist only as a celebration frozen in memory, a body suspended in midair, leg split, arm cocked back, gravity momentarily humiliated. The human highlight film wasn't just a nickname, it was a promise to fans that something impossible was about to happen. When Wilkins took off, arenas held their breath. When he landed, basketball felt less like a sport and more like spectacle. But behind the dunks, the posters, and the roaring crowds, there is a quieter truth that time has slowly revealed. A truth built not on scandal or downfall, but on cost. Dominique Wilkins didn't merely play basketball. He punished his body for it. Every leap was violent. Every landing sent shock through his joints. Night after night, season after season, he asked his body to do what it was never designed to do repeatedly. And for years, it said yes. Not because it was painless, but because pain was something players of his era were taught to ignore. Fans saw flight. Wilkins felt impact. In the late 1980s, Wilkins was unavoidable. Atlanta revolved around him. Defensive schemes bent and broke. Highlight reels filled endlessly with his image soaring above helpless defenders. The slam dunk contest became his battleground, his rivalry with gravity and history unfolding in slow motion. He wasn't just competing against other players. He was redefining what athletic dominance looked like. What the audience never saw were the mornings after. The stiffness that lingered longer each year. The swelling that ice couldn't fully calm. The soreness that never quite disappeared. This was a time before load management, before rest days were normalized. Stars didn't sit. They endured. And Wilkins endured in silence, because that was the unspoken contract of greatness. Then came the injury that should have ended everything. In January 1992, Dominique Wilkins tore his Achilles tendon, one of the most feared injuries in professional sports, especially for a player whose greatness depended on explosive lift and speed. At that time, an Achilles tear was widely viewed as a career-ending verdict. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. Media skepticism, medical caution, quiet consensus that the highlights were finished. But Wilkins refused to accept that ending. He returned the following season and did the unthinkable, averaging over 29 points per game. It was hailed as one of the greatest comebacks in NBA history. Fans called it heroic. The league called it legendary. What no one talked about was the price that comeback demanded. To return at that level, Wilkins had to change how he moved, how he landed, how his body absorbed force. Stress shifted to knees, hips, and lower back. Muscles compensated for what the tendon no longer could. He didn't defeat the injury. He postponed its consequences. And postponement is not escape. By the time Wilkins retired, the damage was already embedded. His body was worn far beyond his years. Chronic pain wasn't an occasional visitor. It was a constant presence. Movement required awareness. Recovery demanded patience. The man who once soared without thought now had to negotiate with his own body simply to stay functional. That transition carries a psychological weight few ever discuss. Wilkins doesn't remember himself as ordinary. He remembers flight. He remembers domination. He remembers what it felt like to be unstoppable. Every ache is measured not against other men his age, but against the version of himself who once defied physics. There's another layer to the heartbreak. Wilkins gave everything to the game, yet his legacy often sits in an uncomfortable place, admired, but frequently framed by what never came. Championships, final triumphs, ultimate validation. He carried franchises, filled arenas, and delivered moments fans will never forget. But the story didn't end with a ring, and that absence lingers longer than highlights ever could. After retirement, Wilkins stayed close to basketball. Front office roles, public appearances, ambassador duties. But proximity is not participation. Watching others rise while your own body resists movement is its own quiet form of grief. And unlike today's athletes, Wilkins came from a generation trained to suppress vulnerability. Pain was private. Struggle was hidden. You didn't complain. You endured. So he endured again, this time without applause. At 65, Dominique Wilkins is alive, respected, and honored. But tragedy doesn't require death. Sometimes it lives in what remains, a body that paid the full price for greatness, a legacy celebrated but not fully understood, a man who gave fans unforgettable moments while silently sacrificing his future comfort. The human highlight film didn't fade out. He burned until there was nothing left to give. And that is where the real heartbreak truly begins. When the lights finally dimmed and the noise faded, Dominique Wilkins discovered a truth many legends are never prepared for. The end of a career doesn't arrive with closure. It arrives with silence. No buzzer. No ceremony that explains what comes next. Just mornings without a schedule, without adrenaline, without a reason to push through pain. Yet the pain remains anyway. The physical aftermath was only the beginning. Years of explosive play had left his joints permanently altered. Former teammates have spoken about how players from that era often live with chronic pain as a baseline, not an exception. For Wilkins, movement became something deliberate. Stairs required thought. Travel required recovery. The body that once obeyed instinct now demanded negotiation. But the deeper wound was psychological. For decades, Wilkins' identity was inseparable from performance. He wasn't just known for basketball. He was basketball emotion. His value, his validation, even his daily rhythm were built around competition. Retirement stripped that structure away overnight. And unlike younger generations who plan exits years in advance, Wilkins came from a time when you simply played until you couldn't. So when it ended all at once. There's a specific kind of grief reserved for athletes who lose not just a job, but a version of themselves. Wilkins didn't miss the crowds alone. He missed the certainty. The certainty that he mattered every night. The certainty that pain had purpose. Without the game, pain became just pain. He stayed close to the league, taking on executive and ambassador roles, particularly with the Atlanta Hawks. To outsiders, it looked like a smooth transition. But proximity can be cruel. Being around the game without being able to participate forces constant comparison between who you are and who you were, between memory and reality. And then there is the legacy question. Dominique Wilkins is celebrated, but often with an asterisk fans don't say out loud. One of the greatest scorers ever. One of the greatest dunkers ever. Yet the conversation inevitably circles back to what he never won. Championships became the missing chapter that distorted how his sacrifice was remembered. The narrative rarely acknowledges that he gave everything anyway, sometimes more than his body could afford. That imbalance lingers. In private moments, Wilkins has acknowledged the long-term consequences of playing through pain. Not regret. He has never framed it that way, but realism. The understanding that greatness extracts payment later, when cameras are gone and applause no longer masks discomfort. At 65, his life is quieter. Health is managed, not assumed. Strength is measured, not displayed. And yet, the fire that once lifted him above defenders still exists, just redirected toward endurance instead of dominance. This is why his story is heartbreaking in a way highlights can't capture. Because Dominique Wilkins didn't fall. He didn't implode. He didn't disgrace his legacy. He survived it. He survived a career that demanded everything from his body. He survived expectations that never allowed weakness. He survived the silence that followed greatness. And survival, when it comes after flight, can be its own form of tragedy. The human highlight film is no longer airborne. But the cost of those moments still echoes in every careful step he takes. That is the part of the story history rarely slows down long enough to see. As time moved forward, Dominique Wilkins began to understand something that only distance can teach. Greatness does not end cleanly. It fades unevenly. Some days, memory is louder than pain. Other days, pain speaks first. And for a man who once trusted his body without question, that reversal changes everything about how life is lived. There are moments when Wilkins is still recognized before he speaks. A pause, a widening of the eyes, the name said with excitement, sometimes disbelief. Fans remember the dunks instantly, the explosion, the violence of lift. What they don't see is how carefully he now manages his movement in those same moments. How posture is adjusted, how steps are measured, how endurance is rationed. This is the quiet reality of a body that has already given its lifetime allotment of impact. Former players from his era often describe the same pattern. Pain that doesn't disappear, only shifts. Knees that ache in cold weather. Hips that tighten after sitting too long. Backs that remind them every morning what they once demanded. Wilkins is no exception. The difference is that his style of play magnified the cost. Every dunk that thrilled millions also multiplied the toll waiting decades later. And yet, regret is not the dominant emotion. What complicates Wilkins' story is pride. Not arrogance, but ownership. He knows exactly what he gave. He knows how rare his ability was. He knows how many nights he carried teams that would have collapsed without him. That knowledge brings strength, but it also sharpens the pain. Because when you know how extraordinary you once were, the contrast is impossible to ignore. The game moved on. Basketball evolved into something faster, more spaced, more analytically optimized. New stars emerged. New highlights replaced old ones. Dunk contests found new champions. Slowly, the league that once revolved around Wilkins' elevation began referencing him in past tense only. For many legends, that transition feels like erasure. Wilkins remained visible. Ceremonies, anniversaries, tributes, but visibility is not relevance. Being honored for what you were does not satisfy the part of you that still feels capable, still remembers domination. That internal dissonance lingers longer than applause ever did. There's also the burden of example. Younger players look at Wilkins as proof that fearlessness pays off. Few ask whether the payment is immediate or deferred. Few consider the cost that arrives after the final buzzer, when joints don't regenerate and adrenaline no longer shields pain. Wilkins understands this now in a way highlights never could explain. At 65, his life is not defined by collapse, but by adaptation. Exercise becomes maintenance. Strength becomes preservation. Joy comes from moments, not momentum. The thrill of flight has been replaced by the discipline of restraint. And that shift, more than any injury, is where the heartbreak truly settles. Because Dominique Wilkins did everything right according to the rules of his era. He played hard. He played through pain. He gave fans everything they came to see. He never cheated the game. The game simply collected later. He is not broken. He is not forgotten. But he is carrying the invisible weight of a career that demanded perfection at full speed, every night, with no safety net. The human highlight film still exists in memory, frozen midair forever. The man who created it lives on the ground now, steady, careful, enduring. And that contrast is the tragedy no highlight reel can ever show. The deeper tragedy of Dominique Wilkins is not merely the physical toll that's been taken. The pain in his knees, the strain in his back, the tightness in his hips, though these are certainly parts of it. It's the realization that for a man who lived in the air for so long, the ground beneath him feels foreign. He, who defied gravity with the effortless grace of a poet, now finds the most difficult moments of his life grounded in the reality of human frailty. Wilkins was a man who soared when the world told him to stay grounded. His dunks were more than athletic feats. They were statements. He wasn't just playing basketball. He was rewriting the rules of how it could be played. He was not just showing his skill. He was showcasing a kind of power, a power that came from within and pushed against the limits of his body, his sport, and his environment. Fans didn't just watch him dunk. They witnessed him soar to the kind of greatness that felt untouchable. But untouchable only lasts until the body can no longer keep up. Now, as the years have passed, the once celebrated NBA star is no longer a symbol of constant elevation. Instead, Dominique Wilkins' story has quietly transformed into something more reflective, more intimate, and far more painful to reckon with. But the tragedy of Wilkins' story doesn't lie in the fall itself. It lies in the fact that so many legends like him are remembered for what they did, not what it took to do it. Unlike the newer generation of athletes who are now more mindful of their physical limits, thanks to advances in sports science, recovery protocols, and mental health awareness, Wilkins and his peers played through a culture of toughness, where the expectation was to endure without showing weakness. The concept of load management or resting was almost foreign to the stars of Wilkins' time. Back then, players were expected to play through pain, even at the risk of compromising their bodies for years to come. That culture of unrelenting endurance has left many players of Wilkins' era grappling with their physical realities long after the cheers fade. Wilkins, like his contemporaries, didn't have the option to slow down until it was too late. As he watches the next generation of players handle their bodies with more care, there's a strange bitterness, a sense of irony that the very same system that celebrated his resilience is now the one that quietly acknowledges the dangers of pushing oneself to the limit without regard for the future. And so, for Wilkins, his story, though often celebrated in retrospective highlight reels and Hall of Fame speeches, is also a cautionary tale. A tale of triumph and sacrifice, yes, but also a tale of a generation of players who gave everything to a game without realizing the full cost until the game was over. When he accepted his place in the NBA Hall of Fame, there was no denial of the greatness he achieved. The hundreds of highlights, the millions of fans who adored him, the records that still stand. But in his acceptance speech, there was a quiet reflection on the physical toll he had borne. What no one could see in those moments of glory was the cost of his flight. The injuries, the constant battles with pain, and the psychological toll of knowing that the body would no longer allow him to perform at the highest level. Wilkins' journey has not been without recognition. He's been honored, celebrated, and immortalized. His name will forever be etched in the annals of basketball history. But his legacy, and the legacy of so many like him, is often misunderstood. What is remembered in the public eye is the moment of triumph. But what is most overlooked is the price paid for those moments. Wilkins didn't just give his body to basketball. He gave his future. And in return, he lives with the awareness that the sacrifices he made have left him in a constant battle with his own body. Now, at 65, his story continues, not as a tale of what once was, but as one of survival. Not just surviving the aftermath of a career, but surviving in a world where the memories of greatness are often more painful than fulfilling. Where the knowledge of what was once possible now weighs heavily on a man who has to fight to maintain the very thing he once mastered effortlessly. The human highlight film was never meant to end in silence. It was supposed to keep soaring, keep creating, keep changing the game. But as Wilkins reflects on the years that have followed, it's clear that this is the real tragedy. Greatness is often the most isolating thing to bear. The flight may end, but the weight of its legacy can remain forever. Wilkins survived the physical pain. He survived the criticism. He survived the passage of time. But now, at 65, he is learning to survive something even more difficult, the absence of the flight. While Dominique Wilkins may no longer soar above the rim, his influence on basketball, especially within the Atlanta Hawks community, has never wavered. Even as age and injury have gradually grounded him, his spirit and passion for the game remain undimmed, reshaping his post-basketball life in ways that continue to resonate. In the years following his retirement, Wilkins transitioned to a variety of roles, not just as an ambassador of the Atlanta Hawks, but as a vocal advocate for the future of basketball, ensuring that the next generation would not make the same physical sacrifices he did. He is often seen at games, in the media, and at community events, but there's something more profound behind this visibility. It's not merely about maintaining his connection to the sport. It's about rectifying the mistakes of the past, particularly when it comes to health and wellness. Post-retirement, Wilkins became an active participant in the conversation around player health, something that was often ignored in the 1980s and 1990s. As an advocate for better health practices, he uses his story, one filled with physical pain and regret over unaddressed injuries, to influence how athletes are treated by the sports world. He shares openly about the reality of playing through chronic injuries, encouraging younger players to prioritize their long-term health. Wilkins has worked with NBA players, younger athletes, and youth programs, giving talks on how to manage physical strain, how to understand the importance of recovery, and how to extend careers with a focus on self-care. He remains an advocate for better medical treatment for athletes, especially when it comes to mental and physical rehabilitation post-career. In many ways, Wilkins' continued involvement with the game is a way of coping with the emotional toll of his career. While the physical pain of his basketball days remains, it's the quiet emotional labor, the what-ifs, the moments missed, the unrelenting strain of self-imposed greatness that lingers most. For someone who was the centerpiece of a franchise, whose every leap was watched by thousands, retirement forced him to reckon with his identity. He was no longer the human highlight film. He was a former athlete navigating a world that had long moved past his heyday. But this period of transition has had its moments of redemption. Over the years, Wilkins has been inducted into the NBA Hall of Fame, securing his rightful place in the pantheon of the greatest basketball players to ever step onto the court. But even as he stood among legends of the Hall of Fame ceremony, a bittersweet truth prevailed. Even the brightest careers come with shadows. The applause was loud, but it was not as loud as the silence he had lived with post-retirement. There's a recognition, however, that this applause is not for what he lost, but for what he gave, both to the game and to those who witnessed his resilience. What Wilkins' story reveals is the hidden cost of greatness. It's a cost that no one, especially those who are just beginning their careers, is truly prepared for. The media, fans, and even fellow players see the glory, the victories, and the statistics, but they don't see the long nights spent fighting pain or the quiet struggles with identity after the final buzzer rings. Wilkins' life post-retirement shows that surviving the weight of greatness isn't just about physical pain. It's about emotional endurance. Athletes like him carry their legacies in the same way they carried their teams, with pride, but also with an undercurrent of quiet sacrifice. Wilkins didn't just perform for the crowd. He performed for himself. And now, after all the accolades, what remains is the question of what happens when the performance is over and the spotlight fades. Despite it all, he continues to rise in his own way. He is now a mentor, a symbol of enduring legacy, and a voice of wisdom to those who play after him. At 65, Wilkins is far more than a figure of nostalgia. His survival is a testament to both his physical and mental fortitude. It's not just about surviving injuries or physical limitations. It's about surviving the shadow of the legacy he built, the expectations that came with it, and the emotional toll of having your career defined by the very thing you no longer have the power to do. He did it all for the game, but now he's doing it for himself, proving that even when greatness fades, it doesn't have to disappear entirely. Dominique Wilkins, the human highlight film, may no longer be the same man who dominated the air, but the lessons he imparts are timeless, about perseverance, legacy, health, and the inevitable balance between what you give and what you lose. His career was a blueprint for power and grace, but his post-career life is a guide to survival. In the grand narrative of Dominique Wilkins, his impact cannot be limited to just his athleticism. His career represents a turning point for future generations of athletes, serving as both a lesson in resilience and a cautionary tale. But perhaps the most important aspect of Wilkins' journey is how his life continues to ripple through the world of sports, not only through his role as a former NBA star, but also in his efforts to reshape the conversation around athlete health and well-being. When Wilkins was making his mark on the NBA, the world of professional sports was vastly different in terms of health and recovery. Few athletes in his era had the resources or knowledge to fully understand the long-term impact of their physical sacrifices. There are no team doctors specializing in injury prevention, no emphasis on mental health, and certainly no societal push to talk openly about the consequences of extreme physicality in sports. Fast forward to today, and things have changed. The younger generation of athletes now benefits from state-of-the-art medical technology, nutritionists, mental health resources, and recovery specialists who aim to protect the longevity of their careers. The rise of load management, sports psychologists, and advanced recovery techniques like cryotherapy and cryochambers shows just how far the culture has evolved. Wilkins, in his own way, is now part of this shift. Through his advocacy and personal experiences, he's contributed to raising awareness about the importance of taking care of an athlete's body before it's too late. He speaks openly about his own struggles with pain, often highlighting how he wished he had known better ways to care for himself. His message today is one of proactive care and self-awareness, lessons that have become far more common in today's NBA, yet were learned the hard way for Wilkins and others of his generation. His voice has become vital in making sure today's athletes don't repeat the same mistakes. Wilkins often reflects on how, back in his prime, there was no talk of resting or preventative care. It was about playing through everything. Now, his role has transformed from player of unparalleled talent to someone working to ensure others don't suffer in the same way. An often overlooked part of Wilkins' legacy is his commitment to the mental health of athletes. Post-retirement life for athletes can be isolating, often marked by the loss of identity. For a man who spent decades under the spotlight, facing daily pressure to perform, the transition into retirement can be jarring. Wilkins speaks candidly about this shift, acknowledging that the emotional toll of leaving the game is just as significant as the physical one. In an era when mental health wasn't discussed openly in sports, Wilkins' ability to talk about his post-career struggles, from identity loss to depression, has become part of his most important advocacy. He's been instrumental in encouraging athletes to seek mental health care and normalize the conversations around it. His message is simple but profound. It's okay to not be okay, and asking for help doesn't make you weak. This was uncharted territory in his time, but now more athletes are speaking up about the mental challenges they face. The conversations around post-retirement struggles, the pressure of constant performance, and the mental exhaustion of maintaining a public persona are shifting, largely due to trailblazers like Wilkins who are willing to break down those barriers. Looking at Wilkins' legacy through the lens of his physical sacrifice and his advocacy, one can argue that the true meaning of his career extends far beyond basketball. His journey embodies the idea of sustaining greatness while evolving. While his body has given out in certain ways, his message, influence, and the way he has turned his struggles into a blueprint for others is undeniable. Wilkins has become an icon not just for his athletic achievements, but for the way he navigated the human cost of those achievements. Today, he is both a reminder of what was and a bridge to what could be, showing us how the sports world has grown and continues to grow, but also how much further it must go to protect its greatest assets, the athletes themselves. And it's this enduring power to evolve, to advocate, and to survive that marks Wilkins as a true legend, not just in basketball, but in how athletes live their lives beyond the sport. His greatest strength isn't what he did on the court. It's what he continues to do for those who follow. As we reflect on Wilkins' enduring influence, it's clear that his story is still unfolding. His efforts to advocate for athletes' health, especially when it comes to mental and physical recovery, continue to be felt in the modern NBA. He remains a symbol of what it means to give everything for your sport, and, just as importantly, to know and advocate for yourself when the game ends. In a way, Dominique Wilkins has become an emblem for all the athletes who will come after him. His journey wasn't just about the highs he reached, but about how he learned to carry the lows with grace and continue pushing forward. His advocacy, both for the physical care of athletes and the importance of mental health, will echo for years to come, helping to create a safer, more sustainable future for those who dare to soar, just as he once did. As Dominique Wilkins reaches the later years of his life, his legacy remains a complex mix of triumph and sacrifice. The world remembers the human highlight film, a man who could fly through the air and electrify crowds. Yet, the full depth of his story, the physical pain, the emotional toll, and the quiet struggle for self-identity after basketball remains largely untold. This part of Wilkins' journey is one of rediscovery and advocacy. It's no longer just about the dunks and points. It's about ensuring that future generations of athletes are better equipped to handle the physical demands of the sport and take control of their mental health as well. After decades of defying gravity, the moment comes when even the most legendary athletes must face the reality of aging. Wilkins, like many of his contemporaries, has dealt with lingering physical pain that often goes unseen by the public. However, the mental challenge of aging and watching younger athletes thrive while knowing your best years are behind you is another layer of difficulty many former stars must endure. Wilkins' transition into life after basketball hasn't been seamless. As his body began to resist the demands of his sport, he had to redefine his identity outside of basketball. This evolution, painful as it was, eventually led him to a new form of empowerment, using his platform to speak up about issues such as player health, mental wellness, and post-career struggles. Wilkins' commitment to health advocacy has expanded far beyond his own experiences. He uses his story to help educate both athletes and the general public about the long-term consequences of playing through pain. No longer just a former player, he has transformed into an activist for athlete care, challenging the system that once glorified playing through injuries at any cost. In interviews and public speeches, he urges athletes to take better care of their bodies, seek help when they need it, and advocate for their mental health. Wilkins has openly shared his regrets about not having access to modern recovery techniques during his playing days, and he makes it a point to share those lessons with younger players who have the resources to prevent long-term damage.